The other day, I opened Instagram and saw a post asking, "What's your favorite grunge band?" Looking at the comments, some answers were Stone Temple Pilots, The Smashing Pumpkins, Seven Mary 3, bands that, in my mind, were definitely not grunge. But am I wrong? What even is grunge in 2024? What was grunge back in 1991? This video is going to take a look at the history of grunge as it was originally defined, aka the Seattle music scene, with an asterisk on Seattle since some of the bands were from other parts of Washington, and I'm going to try to decide, at least for myself, whether it's even a meaningful way to think of the genre anymore. Hi, I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism. At the time when grunge started being used to describe a scene, the term was specifically associated with Seattle. The word's first association with the scene was from a Sub Pop record company catalog. Sub Pop was a big force in not only releasing grunge albums, but in trying to make these fairly unique bands all fit within some kind of a describable scene. Bruce Pavitt, co-founder of the company, described an EP by the band Green River like this: "Gritty vocals, roaring Marshall amps, ultra-loose grunge that destroyed the morals of a generation." This means the first use of grunge in connection with this scene was in 1987. We're going to start a little earlier than 87. Black Sabbath, and in particular Tony Iommi's guitar tuning, would be an influence on the Seattle sound. Soundgarden loved Black Sabbath. For many bands, though, this influence would be filtered through a band called Black Flag. Black Flag was one of the most influential American hardcore punk bands in the early 80s. Not only was their music influential, but the record label founded by their guitarist, Greg Ginn, was massively influential in the development of independent rock during the 80s. Many bands on Greg Ginn's label SST, like Dinosaur Jr., Sonic Youth, Husker Du, Minutemen, and Meat Puppets, were influences on not just the Seattle scene, but on the development of independent rock music around the world. Black Flag's shift away from hardcore punk into a new, slowed-down, lumbering, but just as heavy form of music would be a major influence on early grunge bands. You can hear the starting point for this new sound in the last 3 tracks of their 1984 album, My War. So now, the history is actually moving to Washington, and a band called Bam Bam, in the year 1984. The band revolved around Tina Bell, vocalist, and her husband, Tommy Martin. For a time, their drummer was Matt Cameron, who would go on later to be in Soundgarden and then much later Pearl Jam. Matt Cameron talks about the racism Tina faced at some shows, like people in the audience shouting the N-word at her. He talks about one time she spun her mic like a lasso and sent it out into the crowd, hitting that particular racist douchebag in the face in the middle of her performance. What a fucking badass. But a deeper racism would lead to Bam Bam never having many of the same opportunities that other bands who came along later would have. They never had a record deal, despite having fans and supporters who included Kurt Cobain, who was actually a roadie for them for a time, or Melvins, who had their first tour opening for Bam Bam. Bam Bam played over the years with Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, yet never even had a song included on a grunge compilation album. Tina died in poverty, and after passing, nearly all of her possessions, including whatever Bam Bam history she still owned, was thrown away without the family's consent. So not much recorded music remains from this band, but fortunately we can hear some of the 1984 recordings they funded themselves, on some streaming platforms and on YouTube. Check out the song Ground Zero, which has some notable similarities with later bands from the scene, like Soundgarden. Then we move on to the band who started off opening for Bam Bam. Melvins, formed in 1983, started out playing covers and hardcore punk. But guitarist Buzz Osborne saw Black Flag live and was inspired by their slow, heavy playing. Melvins went deep into exploring this intersection of punk and heavy metal influences with noise, building on what Black Flag had been doing to not only influence the grunge scene, but also be a foundational band in the sludge metal genre. In 1985, a band called Green River released their first EP, Come On Down. Here, you can hear a blending of punk, metal, and garage rock influences. But just as importantly, the guys in this band would be influential on the scene's development. You have Mark Arm and Steve Turner, who would later go on to form Mudhoney, one of the central bands of the scene. Then you have Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament, who would later be in Mother Love Bone, and a few years after that, Pearl Jam. A bigger indication of this new scene came in 1985 with a compilation called Deep Six. This album featured 6 Washington bands: Green River, Malfunction, Soundgarden, Melvins, Skinyard, and U-Men. At this stage, Soundgarden don't sound a whole lot like the band they would grow into. The story goes that Buzz Osborne from Melvins... Oh, hold on, quick side note. While writing this script, I kept accidentally writing Buzz Aldrin, which makes the story even more fascinating, so let's run with that. Anyway, Buzz Aldrin taught Kim Thayil and Mark Arm about drop D tuning, a tuning style that was used by Black Sabbath and Black Flag, and it basically makes stuff sound heavy. Then, Kim Thayil taught this tuning to Jerry Cantrell, and Kurt Cobain was a big Soundgarden fan who used drop D tuning from early on. It's even used on some tracks from Pearl Jam's first album, 10. This tuning, while maybe not an essential piece of what makes grunge, was definitely a commonality for a lot of the bands. So we can really thank Buzz Aldrin for the sound of grunge. So let's get back to how the scene evolved. Green River split up, and some members formed Mudhoney. Others teamed up with Andrew Wood, previously of Malfunction, to form Mother Love Bone. Mother Love Bone had a much more glam and even hair metal-y sound than most people think of with grunge, in part because of Andrew Wood's oversized stage presence and rock star vibe. Then Andrew Wood died of a drug overdose in 1990. In the aftermath, Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament would go on to form Pearl Jam, one of what are now considered grunge's Big Four. Who are the Big Four, you ask? Soundgarden, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam. Why were they the Big Four? Well, they would all get quite big, and there were 4 of them. Soundgarden had a great heavy sound, experimented with unusual time signatures, and made music that somehow still felt accessible despite the complexity of it. Everyone in this band was extremely talented, and Kim Thayil's probably my favorite guitarist from the whole grunge scene. Then they had Chris Cornell on vocals, a man with a ridiculous range who could sing and scream and hit high notes. People at the time assumed for a lot of good reasons that Soundgarden would be the band to break through into the mainstream, but someone else beat them to it. Nirvana was formed by Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic. They had a bit of a Spinal Tap situation with drummers until they found Dave Grohl. Their first album, Bleach, cited influences like Mudhoney, Melvins, and Flipper. They often had a very pop song structure reminiscent of the Pixies, which was balanced out with Kurt's dark and often sarcastic lyrics. But Nirvana also blended in noise elements inspired by bands like Melvins and Flipper. As you probably know, they broke through to the mainstream in a big way with their second album, Nevermind, led by the powerful Smells Like Teen Spirit. Fun fact, the title of the song came from Kathleen Hanna, a musician from Olympia, Washington's riot girl music scene. One night while goofing off at Kurt's place, she wrote, "Kurt smells like teen spirit" on his wall, and he later called her to ask if he could use that for a song title. Then you have Alice in Chains. They were actually the first of the grunge bands to have a hit that I personally saw on MTV, Man in the Box, which came out in 1990 on the album Facelift. Their sound was the heaviest and arguably the darkest of the Big Four, but they showed a lot of versatility as well with acoustic songs, and would record an amazing MTV Unplugged concert as well. Although the band was goofy and fun-loving off stage, their music was dark and brooding, often focused on Layne Staley's heroin addiction. Their second album, Dirt, is considered by many to be one of the defining grunge albums. Then Pearl Jam. Pearl Jam's first album, 10, feels the most like a bridge between the popular rock of the 80s and the sounds that were coming in the 90s. They still jam a lot, and it's definitely hard rock, but there's a darkness and a seriousness to the lyrics that matches the feeling of the other Seattle bands. Pearl Jam would rival Nirvana as the most popular of the grunge bands during the 90s, despite deciding early on that they weren't going to play by some of the industry rules like making music videos. Things really blew up in 1991. Smells Like Teen Spirit went to number 1, and all of the Big Four had major hits during the first few years of the 90s. This is often seen as the moment when the musical aesthetics of the underground rock scene that had existed throughout the 80s finally not only broke through to the charts but landed on top of it. Many bands outside the Big Four grunge bands ended up with new opportunities at major labels because of this. Many of the bands from Seattle's scene were popular for a couple years, but you quickly had imitators, which is not to say that all the bands with a vaguely grunge sound from outside of Seattle were copycats. There were other great bands with histories that went back into the 80s exploring similar sounds, but lots of bands started sounding specifically like they were doing a Pearl Jam or Alice in Chains impersonation. And other music scenes started coming in, as music scenes usually do, like nu metal and Britpop, taking away the attention from these grunge bands on the radio. Nirvana still saw plenty of radio play throughout the mid-90s, but many mainstream fans were already turning away from them when they released their aggressive and amazing third album, In Utero. In '94, Kurt Cobain died by suicide. Soundgarden broke up in 1997, and Alice in Chains went inactive shortly after. Many of the smaller bands went back to independent labels. Lane Staley had a fatal overdose in 2002, and this felt like a bookend on the grunge scene for many people. Then, Chris Cornell passed away in 2017, leaving just one of the Big Four's frontmen with us today. Pearl Jam, the band that sounded the most hard rock, weathered the storm best, continuing to this day, and building a reputation for great live shows. Just as it's hard to find a starting point for grunge, there's no clear ending. Both Mudhoney and Pearl Jam have released albums this year, 2024, and newer rock bands are still being influenced by the Seattle sound today. But for the love of God, what exactly is the sound of grunge? When it comes to the sound, the explanation that makes the most sense to me is, it's what you get when you mix elements of punk, metal, and more traditional hard rock, like Led Zeppelin. There's obviously a huge range of options in how you can mix these elements, which is why you end up with bands that fit these boundaries but sound very different, as opposed to other descendants of punk and metal that never broke through into the mainstream, like crust punk or crossover thrash. I believe this connection to more traditional song structures coming from the hard rock inspiration is what makes the music sound new, but also not foreign enough that the mainstream can't understand. Each of the Seattle bands found a different way to combine these elements, but to one degree or another, you can find a melding of the three different genres in all of these grunge bands we've discussed. Let's now start asking the hard questions. Is Stone Temple Pilots a grunge band? They fit on this graph thingy just fine. And the more I think about it, the more I think the answer is, who gives a shit? Grunge is a term that came out of wanting to market a set of unique bands. If on your musical journey it makes sense to say STP is a grunge band, the actual bands from the scene really don't care. Most of them disliked the term even when it was new, and just identified as rock bands. Having grown up with the scene getting so much attention, I think a little bit differently from someone who's wanting to, say, start a grunge band in 2024. I come in with all of this baggage from the past, but I'm ready to let that go, and if you want to start a grunge band, I'm not going to say you can't, because you're not born in Seattle and you don't have any baggy flannel handy. Speaking of flannel, when it comes to the look of grunge, it's been described not as an anti-fashion, like punk, but an unfashion, as in not even an attempt at having one. The clothes that were popular amongst those in the scene were popular because they were cheap, durable, and could be found easily at thrift stores. It's hard to imagine now, but Seattle at the time was quite poor. Shows in the early Seattle scene would often be attended mostly by friends of the bands, and people from the other bands in the scene. This insularity, being physically separate from the LA and New York music scenes that were getting more mainstream attention, led to a lot of the crossovers in sound and aesthetics that are now associated with grunge. So the clothes were not an intentional fashion, at least not until labels like Sub Pop started trying to explain and define this movement in a way that would make it more marketable. At that point, there was an effort to make these bands fit that sort of image, and the flannel and lumberjack apparel really started taking over. An unfashion became a fashion, at least for a small window of a few years. And now, like other countercultural looks, like goth, punk, etc., it's just another aesthetic for most people. Getting back to the music, where's a good starting place in exploring grunge? If you prefer playlists over albums, I've put together 2 grunge playlists you can explore. Grunge 101 is for a grunge newbie who wants to know what songs they might have heard when grunge was hitting the mainstream, from 1990 until about 1996. Grunge Roots is a playlist for those who want to go deeper and hear the bands that formed the early scene, and other great bands that didn't get quite so much radio time and came later on. This is where I'll share some bands I didn't have time to even mention in this video. For those of you who like albums, I'm going to cover some of what I consider the most essential from the Big Four. Why am I limiting what I'm going over so much? Well, this is actually the first part of a 2-parter. And in the next video, I'm going to give some of the other important bands of the scene more time, instead of just superficially covering them in this one. I'm staying with the Big Four, so I can give some recommendations without keeping us both here all day. Starting with Soundgarden, I think of Badmotorfinger and Super Unknown as essential. Fans tend to be split around which of these 2 is the best. To me, it's Super Unknown easily. Both albums are the band at their creative peak, following their not great first album, and then their good but not especially original second album. Their third, Bad Motorfinger, has major hits like Rusty Cage, Outshined, and Jesus Christ Pose, but it's full of other great tracks like Mind Riot, Room 1,000 Years Wide, and Holy Water. Chris Cornell's vocals are stunning, and the music is diverse. It feels like this is where they really found their unique sound, managing to meld heavy riffs and dark lyrics with choruses that have strong enough hooks for radio. But Super Unknown is just something else. It goes further beyond hard rock and captures a genuinely ominous feeling at times that was only really hinted on Bad Motorfinger. My favorite Soundgarden songs are mostly the non-hits from this album, like 4th of July, Mailman, and Like Suicide. This album captures the band at their most accessible with big anthems like Spoonman and My Wave, but these moments are perfectly balanced with the band's darkest and most fully realized and best produced work in my opinion. Super Unknown is essential with a little crown. Next, Pearl Jam. Their first album, 10, is essential, and I'd say Vitalogy is equally so. 10 has a bunch of big hits and some other good songs, and of all the grunge albums, this one enjoys its solos the most. In fact, I feel like this is the grunge essential that feels the least grunge. Eddie Vedder's dark vocals make it fit, but I can feel the 80s hair metal still inspiring some of the musical choices. It's still very good though, especially if you're into the more hard rock side of grunge. Vitalogy is my favorite Pearl Jam album. The band shows more range here, and have moved further away from their hard rock roots into a style that is sometimes more punk, sometimes brooding and sinister, and then every now and then they deliver a devastating ballad. It also includes some of their stranger tracks that feel like they could be jokes, but I think that in this case, the variety of the album really works to show a band full of good ideas, willing to try them all out. Alice in Chains is next, and I consider Dirt and Jar of Flies essential. Dirt was their darkest, heaviest album. Compared to their first album, Facelift, it felt like their sound was honed and some of their sillier tendencies had worn off. Some of the band's strongest songs, like Wood, Rooster, and Them Bones are on this one. As I mentioned earlier, the lyrics were shifting towards Lane Staley's addiction to heroin, as can be heard on songs like Junkhead. This darkness carried over onto the following Jar of Flies EP. This EP is much less heavy musically, but it's still just as dark, and here Alice in Chains really demonstrates how talented and versatile they are, making a sonically more subtle release that feels undoubtedly like Alice in Chains despite that. It's a beloved EP by fans, and honestly, I think I enjoy this more than Dirt. Both are grunge essentials though. Finally, Nirvana. They only made 3 albums, and in my opinion, they're all grunge essentials. The first was noisy, lo-fi, hectic, but still had those catchy, hooky 3-chord melodies that made Nirvana so infectious. Then you have Nevermind, which... it's Nevermind. Do I even need to talk about this one? Several of the biggest hits in grunge are on here, and it's the album that kicked down the door into the mainstream. Then you have In Utero, which is the heaviest of the 3, challenging those mainstream fans they picked up to follow them into uncharted territories. This move distanced a lot of their fans at the time, but it did signal a time when rock music did, in fact, get even heavier. Think of the nu metal scene that was coming along shortly after. But grunge goes way beyond these mid-80s influences, and then the Big Four. There were many great bands, both from Seattle and from elsewhere, exploring a similar sound that made albums I think are essential for anyone exploring this genre. So in my next video, I'll be focusing on the best albums by other bands from the grunge scene. And that one is going to be a countdown. So stay tuned, and if you're watching this video after the follow-up has gone live, I'll link to it at the end of the video. Thanks for watching Eclecticism. This channel is a love letter to music, for those who love music. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and check out some other videos like the one on the screen right now. Take care of yourself, and see you next time.